This morning we are going to talk about covenants. Ooh, exciting, right? 2 of them. So like double the fun. And what we're going to do with them is we're going to examine them and turn them over and look at what's underneath them, and we're going to compare them and contrast them. And we're going to do this because these 2 covenants work side by side as instruction for God's people. Seen next to each other, these 2 covenants help us understand what it looks like to be in a growing, trusting relationship with God, which I imagine most of us are here this morning because that's what we desire, to have a growing, trusting relationship with God. And compare that to what it looks like to be in a distant, impersonal relationship with God. I'm convinced that because we do not read the First Testament well, we are often unaware of the ways in which we depersonalize God and push him away. Often, while saying we desire a personal relationship with him above all else. And so keep that in mind as we come near to the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses is laying them out, 2 covenants, both of which have dramatically different ends. And so we start reading in Deuteronomy 29, verse 1. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb. The Lord has commanded Moses to make a covenant with the people of Israel in the land of Moab. This is where they are currently residing, and this is what is now happening. And this covenant is besides the covenant that was made at Horeb. Now remember, Horeb is another name for Sinai. And a few other translations might help us catch a sense of how these covenants might be related. So the ESV, which is what I generally read out of on a Sunday morning, describes the covenant made in Moab as besides the one at Horeb. Everett Fox's translation says, the covenant in Moab is aside from the one at Horeb. And the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, describes the one in Moab as being in addition to the one at Horeb. What's fascinating about this is that just about every scholar and every translation recognizes that the covenants made in Horeb and Moab are distinct. But I found only one commentator who thinks that these are different covenants. The majority treat these 2 covenants as though they are the same covenant, with the covenant made at Moab being a renewal of the covenant made at Sinai, just as somebody might have a vow renewal for their wedding 25 years later. The same kind of thing is at work here, so some think, that it's just a different place and a new generation. If you have an ESV translation, all you have to do is look at your heading right there. The covenant renewed in Moab gives you an idea of how they view this passage. The problem with this treatment of the covenant is that there is actually no renewal ceremony that takes place anywhere in this passage. There's only a description of another covenant that is apparently made available to the Israelites. And so we're left thinking, what are these covenants and what do they mean? When we think of Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, when we think of the First Testament, the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures, when we think of the law, when we think of the Old Covenant, we tend to draw all of these ideas together into one single covenant, the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai. And then when we struggle with the First Testament, reading it and trying to understand it in light of Jesus, our struggle is often the result of having only one covenant in play. But chapter 29 sets the stage for a second covenant. Within this chapter, we hear descriptions of both, and it's important that we hear them. So, chapter 29, verse 10. You are standing today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders and your officers, all of the people of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the sojourner who is in your camp, from the one who chops your wood to the one who draws your water, so that you may enter into the sworn covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is making with you today, that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, as he promised you, and as he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. It is not with you alone that I am making this sworn covenant, but with whoever is standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and with whoever is not here with us today. That's pretty inclusive. Everyone who's here and not here. Wait a second. We're confronted with the context of this covenant. It is the one that was sworn to the Israelites' fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's necessary to note that the covenant made at Sinai came after Abraham, and so was not sworn to Abraham. And so we have our first hint here at where these two covenants are coming from. One from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and one later. As chapter 29 continues, then Moses describes a future situation where Israel has experienced God's wrath and the nations are in awe. And so in verse 24, we keep reading, where the nations ask, why has the Lord done thus to this land? What caused the heat of this great anger? And the people will say, it is because the Israelites abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshiped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book, and the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land as they are this day. This should sound very familiar to what we looked at last week in the curses that unfolded as part of the covenant. But can you hear the distinction between the two? One covenant was made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The other was made when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt at Sinai, or Horeb. There we go. Two covenants, side by side, for Israel's instruction, for our instruction. Let me illustrate these two covenants with two more covenants side by side. My marriage covenant with Jane. She's not here, so I can say anything I want. An unconditional set of vows that I made to her. And the other marriage covenant that I often find myself imposing on our marriage. The one that I use to get what I want, or temporarily please Jane, or at least satisfy her wrath. So let me explain these. The shower is where I do most of my good thinking. Jane is often the recipient of my shower thoughts as she's busy getting ready in the bathroom. And I will often just jabber away, whether she can hear me or not, and I often find that she's actually gone as I'm, mid-thought, whatever. As I was working through this morning's message, and I was struck by something, and I called out to Jane. I said, hey, yeah, I need to apologize. As I opened the shower door, I could see the confusion and nervousness on her face. And so I said, I'm sorry that I always ask what I can do to help you. If she was confused before, why would you be sorry about that? She asked me. I'm sorry because I almost always know what would be helpful before I ask. And by asking, it often gets me off the hook. See, when I can think of 3 or 4 things that might be helpful, you usually only ask for 1 or 2. And because you didn't ask for more, I can reasonably get away with less and without guilt because you didn't tell me you needed more. And in this process, I can make you feel like I was being helpful, and I was, and I can make myself feel good by having done something. Jane just stares at me. Wow, that actually means a lot. Your shower thoughts don't usually come out making that much sense. Fair enough. My wedding vows were pretty lofty. To love, serve, cherish, and be faithful to my wife, no matter what. No matter what she does, no matter whether she upholds her vows or not. Our wedding, though, wasn't a bargain. And it wasn't an agreement. We both made vows, and we both made them in the same place and in the same service, but mine were independent of hers. My vows stand on their own terms. And it's always a bit challenging when you find yourself coming up short. Or worse, when you discover that you've been trying to substitute a new set of vows for something really infinitely better. As I look at how I ask Jane how I can help her as this sort of roundabout way of getting out of having to do too much, I'm fascinated by what my vows end up turning into. They essentially become, I vow to love you as much as is needed to keep peace in our home. I vow to serve you as much as needed to keep you from getting frustrated about how much time I spend on my iPad. I vow to cherish you with enough dates and special gestures that things always sort of feel all right with us. And in each of these newly revised vows, I'm able to set a pretty clear agenda for maintaining a pleasant, strifeless home. I can determine exactly how unloving, how selfish, how devaluing, and how unfaithful I can be, I can get away with, and still sort of keep my marriage intact. But none of these revised vows, loving, serving, cherishing, being faithful just enough, is sufficient to bring my bride fully alive the way that God has called me to. Can you see the way that these covenants play out? One is a covenant of extravagant, sort of boundless love and self-initiation, or where this love and these gestures is self-initiated. The other is a covenant of law that wants and seeks to do just what is necessary. What's fascinating about this is that both have the same basic commitments. I promise to serve my wife, but one results in me taking the initiative to listen to her, to hear her, to know her, to understand her, and then to wash her feet, serving her in unpleasant and maybe even undesirable ways. But the other covenant starts in the same place, but it results in follow-up questions. Okay, I can serve, but when we say serve, what exactly do we mean? Like, are we talking about serving at a restaurant, or are we talking about serving like in a game of ping pong, right? We become wordsmiths, and we try to get around the heavy cost of our vows. A covenant of law understands that good behavior, a bit of extra serving, might result in some rewards. It also understands that a lack of serving can result in frustration and bitterness. Last week, we looked at the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai, and this is what we see unfolding between God and his people. Keeping God at a distance, Israel asks God, will you tell us what to do? and God does. But rewards and punishments aren't enough to sustain a relationship with God. And this is what Torah has been teaching us all along. This is what it intends to teach us and to instruct us in, and to offer us then an alternative. Here in chapters 29 and 30, we discover that God is offering Israel an alternative. They can learn from the covenant of law. They can see where it leads, which is ultimately back into the very slavery that their God rescued them from. And they can choose instead the covenant that is set beside it, the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a covenant that is now available to them in this day. It is a covenant, though, that will require far more from them than the law ever did. See, the Sinai covenant could be observed just by doing it. For those tempted to think that it was too difficult, Paul didn't seem to have any problem saying that he was righteous according to the law, and he wouldn't be the only one described in this way in the New Testament. The covenant made with Abraham, however, required a much more intense devotion to knowing God, to knowing God's desires, to seeking him, to seeking understanding, and to then walking with God. Let me give you an example of this, and I think I've shared a bit of this before. For most of my life, I just sort of took math for granted. Sorry, David. Man, I'm calling you out a lot lately. I would do as little homework as possible in order to get A's or B's in that class, in my math classes. I would figure out what I needed to figure out, even memorize what I needed to memorize to get through each test. I wasn't in the highest math class, and I wasn't at the top of my class in math, but I was high enough to sort of maintain the illusion that I was good at math, at least above average. And with a dad who had a PhD in chemistry, that was kind of important in our home. Then, after pre-calculus, first semester of senior year, I didn't take math for over a year and a half. So that when I transferred schools sophomore year of college, I had to take a math placement test. I was a little bit blown away when I got the results and discovered that I would be taking Math 95, which is before 101. How could I go from pre-calculus down to adding and subtracting negative numbers in just a year and a half? It was pretty simple. I had never worked to understand math. I hadn't really learned it. I had only figured out ways to sort of temporarily get by with my elementary knowledge, because ultimately I didn't value it. What I valued for all of my years in school were grades, and what I valued was going to college. And it turned out that actually learning along the way was somewhat optional within our educational system. And so here I was, a year out of high school in Math 95, and I was faced with a choice. Did I want to learn the foundations of math? Did I really want to understand it, or did I just want to get through it again? But knowing that I had 2 more math classes in front of me, I decided I wanted to understand the foundations. And so for the first time ever in a math class, I set my heart to doing all of the homework. The homework wasn't graded, so there was no credit for it, but I wasn't looking for credit. I was looking for understanding. And so I would take careful notes during class, and I would reread my class notes, and I would rework some of the sample problems from the lecture. And then I would complete not just the suggested homework, but I'd finish all of the problems from the book. And then outside of class time, I would talk to my teacher and try to confirm and make sure that I understood certain concepts that I was kind of feeling fuzzy on. Right now, David's like, I wish all my students were like that. But this is a first for me. My heart changed toward math. The reason for doing it changed. And so my behavior changed along with it. This morning, we're talking about more than covenants. We're talking about heart change. That's what our passage this morning is also about. The heart takes center stage in this passage, but this is not the kind of heart that we're accustomed to talking about. And we'll discover that this change of heart actually requires a process that, at least metaphorically, doesn't sound super pleasant. So turn with me to chapter 30, verse 6, where we're presented with what must happen to our hearts. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and that you may live. Here we read that the Lord intends to do some sort of heart surgery. The image of circumcision, especially of an adult, is fairly graphic in its depiction of cutting away with a sharp knife calloused skin. As we've read throughout Deuteronomy, we've been told that the heart of God's people is stubborn and that it is wicked. Here, the proposed remedy is a cutting away of that which is calloused and hardened, that keeps the heart from loving God wholly and entirely. But the moment that we talk about love and the heart, we're immediately distracted from the point at hand, right? Because the Jewish people did not conceive of the heart as the place where emotion dwells. For the Jews, emotions are usually associated with other organs, the kidneys and the bowels. So next time you're writing a love note to somebody, I love you with all of my bowels. It's probably more Jewish in its conception than your heart. If you're going for sort of romantic love.
Wow.
In the Jewish worldview, the heart is two things. It's more things, but it's primarily these two things. It is the thinker and it is the decider. In other words, the Jewish heart is what we mean when we talk about the mind and the will. A change of heart, then, biblically speaking, when the Bible talks about a change of heart, is not to have your feelings changed about something, but to have your mind changed about something, or to have your will changed about something. When my heart changed toward math, it wasn't that I felt any differently about it. It was that I had a new desire when it came to doing math. I had determined that it had value, and in light of that value, I was set toward doing it, valuing it, accomplishing it, understanding it. Let me show you from our passage how this works itself out in the Bible. Look at chapter 29, verse 11. So we'll jump backwards here for a second. We already kind of read through this a few minutes ago, but we hear it again. Beware lest there be among you a man or woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Right here, the heart is about the will. A person or a tribe turns from worshiping God to instead worshiping other gods. They desire to serve the Lord, and then that desire is turned toward other gods. There's one other important verse to look at here, and so we jump back to chapter 30, verse 1. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and you obey his voice in all that I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul. This is one of those places where we are reminded that we are reading an English translation. A translation where some individual or some group of people have made decisions about how to translate this into English. Here, call them to mind in verse 1. and with all your heart in verse 2 are actually using the same word. The remembering that is happening in verse 1 and the returning that is happening in verse 2 are happening in the same place. Call it the mind or call it the heart. It is the place where we remember things, think about things, decide things, and desire things. In our vocabulary, we generally talk about this as the mind and the will. This week, Derek had us reading the last several chapters of Romans in the Daily Worship Guide, where we learned that a transformation of life requires the renewing of our minds. We have to begin to think in new ways. As we read through the final chapters of Romans, and we heard some of it this morning, we heard Paul calling us to do some things that are significantly harder than anything else we find written in the First Testament law. We read, as with Jesus, this expansion of what is expected of those who truly desire to seek God, to follow Jesus, and to live empowered by the Holy Spirit. These are the kinds of things that we can ever only want when our hearts have been circumcised. Christians today struggle between these covenants. Every day, all around us, people who profess Jesus are busy trying to love him, serve him, cherish him, and be faithful to him just enough to maintain their salvation or whatever else it is that they hope to gain from doing these things. Some call it peace. Some call it blessing. But what we need is a circumcision of our hearts. We need a change of heart. And how can we begin to know if we've experienced that or begun to experience that? I've seen that happen in some way. And I think a starting place for all of us is to evaluate your relationship with God's words. Chapters 29 and 30 are obsessed with how one responds to God's words. Our opening psalm that Dan read for us this morning was about how one is to delight in God's words. When you come face to face with the high standard of God's character, do you explain it away as impossible, or do you delight in these words? Do you seek to live them as an active, loving response to God? And thinking about what we heard earlier from chapter 12, do you find yourself eager to bless those who persecute you? That's not natural. Are you excited about the possibility of coming alongside and weeping with those who weep? Do you spend your time in places where the lowly gather? One of the beautiful things about a word like that is that every time and in every place, that the definition of that word is dramatically different. Are you actively trying to feed your enemies or extend hospitality to those who need to experience God's loving embrace and welcome? As we listened to chapter 12, these aren't a new law being given. These are just actually descriptions of who Jesus was and what he was busy doing throughout his life and his ministry. And so when we look at Jesus, what we see is a life that was so devoted to loving and serving his heavenly Father that these were the natural outpouring of him. And it seems that the expectation is that for those of us who desire the same kind of relationship with the Father that Jesus had, these would also be the things that fill our lives. And so, are these the kinds of things that we delight in, that drive us, that give purpose to our lives? Or do we come to God asking questions similar to what I have often found myself coming to Jane with? How can I help you? But where that question is really about actually avoiding relationship. It's about doing as little as possible It's about getting by. God, what is your will for me? Romans 12 says that if we will be transformed by the renewing of our minds, if we will devote ourselves to God's words, to seeking him, to seeking understanding, that we will know God's will, that these things will emerge from us. I think these two questions, God, what is your will for me? And God, please tell me what to do, actually often become ways that we avoid doing all the things that we already know would bless and please God, and that God has made available to us and revealed to us in his word. And so, what does it look like for us to allow God to circumcise our hearts so that we might seek him, so that we might delight in his words and in his instructions, and so that our whole lives might be given as an offering of love to him who gave his son for us? Amen.